So for today's film, I'm going to be talking about the avant-garde movie, The Girl Chewing Gum, directed by John Smith in 1976. I'm going to argue that this is a structural film which philosophizes about the relationship between subject and object, um, and does so by using the sort of natural relationship within the film of the viewer and the film itself as a analog, or perhaps a metaphor or a schematic representation of that relationship. And I'm going to argue that the conclusion that it draws out of that analysis is that the relationship between subject and object, between the perceiver and the material itself, and sort of the sensation which is experienced therein, is not a passive experience in which a viewer is simply taking in what is really there, but rather is an experience in which the viewer is actively interpreting, handling, and molding, in a certain sense, the actual material or the matter which is appearing before them. Um, that is a constant act of mediation. The film kind of demonstrates that in three very significant climactic ruptures, I'll say, of the movie watcher's understanding. At the beginning of the movie, you're already introduced to this kind of dichotomy where you realize you're already kind of taken out of your sort of like relationship with the film as like a displacement of the ego, what Mulvey would describe as this sort of relegation of the viewer and the screen and the camera with the action, with just what is occurring within the action. You're already introduced now to the director sort of influencing the action. And so that sort of illusion is broken, that illusion of reality is broken, but you're given what feels like something at least more substantially real as a substitute, which is the sense that John Smith is in control of the action, that he's standing behind the camera, that he's giving these instructions to these actors in this sort of avant-garde performance art. Where this shifts and is ruptured is when the camera goes up to this clock tower here, and he finishes describing now the movement of the hands as though they were directions, and he describes those pigeons flying across the screen. That's a really important moment for this movie, because now you realize that he is not there, that he might be calling the shots from after the fact. Woman and the boy. So now that you're not understanding this as John Smith literally, calling the movements of what's occurring on the screen, you're now once again divorced from that reality and put into a new one, in which John Smith, in post-production, is narrating over something which has already been filmed, and then pretending that he was indeed there, that he was calling the shots. So another sort of level of unreality, which appeared to be reality, is peeled back, and you're given to understand that this film, as it's appearing visually, is actually an artifact that's being viewed by John Smith, probably on a screen himself. That's, the more can be said about that kind of already, that level of separation, but as you can see already, and as it continues throughout the film, more of these layers get peeled back, and you're sort of given a progressive understanding of the layers of unreality and reality that are interacting within this movie. I want the man reading Exchange and Marks coming from the right. So you now have the sense that, okay, John Smith is watching this movie himself, the visual film at the very least.
Now
He is no longer perhaps in control in the sense that he thought he was, but he is able to use language to describe what is happening. And as is demonstrated throughout, he tries very hard to sort of, describe what is actually occurring. And he does so seemingly accurately.
In the cinema queue, I want to see a boy and his mother. The boy will be about 8 years old and his mother about 32.
And you're getting this sense that, he is describing what's really happening. But something interesting happens after that level of unreality has been peeled back and you realize that he's sitting there watching it himself, etc. You know now that you're sort of brought to this understanding as the film goes on that he knows more about what's happening than is simply happening on the screen, than is visually happening. And in that way, the language, the verbal narration of what's occurring kind of takes precedence. It's given a kind of reality which the screen does not have. He describes the background of Steele's.
The pigeon, the red Jaguar, the taxi, the man, the van, the Negro with the briefcase and the newspaper.
But even as he does so, he's kind of conflicted because it's getting very difficult for him to sort of describe everything that's happening. There's so much that's occurring. It's beginning to fail for him to sort of, describe the reality. He shuts the sound off.
The man with the walking stick is going home.
And he does things like describe the man going home. He starts imposing his own reality on what's occurring. And you're then given to understand that his language itself, those directions that he gives, even as description, are not able to fully account for what is really happening. They're not real in that sense. He starts creating his own story.
Until recently, I thought the jobs were advertised on the board in 2 languages, English and Greek. However, a few weeks ago, I studied the board carefully and realized that I'd been wrong.
Final rupture, it kind of occurs sort of in multifarious forms here, is when he starts to describe what he's actually seeing, which is not the movie, which is really, he starts describing
wall of the building, there are 8 large doors that are kept wide open throughout the year. I'm shouting into a microphone on the edge of a field near Lechmore Heath, about 15 miles from the building you're looking at. I'm surrounded by electricity pylons and trees. The sky is beginning to cloud over. In the distance, I can see a middle-aged man in a brown duffel coat. He's got a dog with him, which looks like a Labrador, and I think he's got a helicopter in his pocket. In a tree about 20 yards away, I can see a large blackbird with a wingspan of about 9 feet. This young man has just
sound returns, and he goes back to describing what's happening, and he paints this story around this young man who has robbed a post office and is worrying about appearing conspicuous. After sort of creating this complete schism between what's happening, visually and what's happening on an audio level, he then goes back into sort of imposing himself upon what's happening on the screen. At this point in the movie, there are so many different elements in play that are discombobulating the viewer, that are sort of distinguishing the levels of artifice and naturalness in the movie, that there's no way for any viewer really to even to complete and make a coherent whole out of what's occurring. And yet they're sitting there and they're watching the film. The final rupture occurs, of course, when this whole scene is wiped away and the camera resolves itself on the landscape that he describes earlier, just a little bit earlier, where the director supposedly actually is shouting into a microphone. You're now perceiving the world as he sees it. And the sort of final, I guess, confusion or ambiguity in the film that's like really, I think, central to its thesis in a sense is that you're looking at what he's looking at the moment that he's recording the non diegetic sound. But then you have to ask yourself whether or not what's being seen is in itself diegetic to some kind of narrative, whether or not that is the reality or what was occurring before was the reality. The conclusion that the film leads one to have to accept, is that even within the elusive structure of the film, within the sort of, you know, combination of sound and visuals to create a coherent whole, there is no singular reality. There's no one whole that encapsulates everything. Things are in constant conflict with each other because none of these elements are necessarily bound together. That is, the relationship of the viewer to what is actually occurring is not absolute.